In part 1 of this series, I talked about Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles, a nostalgic game from my childhood that I had more to say about than I expected. Playing the game both times and making the video kinda felt like therapy for me. I had the chance to share memories both new and old about a game that few people will get a chance to play as originally intended. Then, in part 2, I talked about 4 games that I played to varying extents. I'm not as passionate about them as with the original Crystal Chronicles, and I know that especially showed near the end with the WiiWare duo, but I gave them a shot in my youth through either actually owning them or downloading demos, so I still mostly enjoyed revisiting them. Going into the writing on both of those videos, I had aspects I knew I wanted to say, topics I needed to explore, and memories I aimed to share. With only a few exceptions, I had an internal outline for the first game script back when I made my cash turn video. Well, now we've got something a bit different. Final Fantasy Crystal Chronicles: The Crystal Bearers. The only entry in the Crystal Chronicles series I played completely blind for these videos. I have no nostalgia, and my only biases relate to what others have said on the game. Everything I say here is based upon my first, somewhat recent experience with it, and a more recent New Game Plus. Yeah, while this video is coming out not long after part 2, I did write the entirety of the first 2 parts half a year ago and put down this script to produce the other sections of that video, meaning my opinions on Crystal Bears had time to stew. Not only that, working on these videos put me into a big Final Fantasy mood, and I've ended up replaying many favorites, as well as filling a few of my gaps in the series. As in, I have played Final Fantasy 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, Strangers in Paradise, and 16 since I began working on this retrospective. And since I wrote that sentence, I'm also halfway through Rebirth. I believe that this FF marathon I've embarked on has granted me a more nuanced perspective on Crystal Bears that I lacked half a year ago, especially with those last 3 I mentioned, but we're gonna need to wait on that. As it turns out, Crystal Bears is not only the strangest Crystal Chronicles game, but one of the weirder in all of Final Fantasy, especially for when it came out. In some ways, it holds on to what the series is known for, while at every other corner, it breaks away from both the Crystal Chronicles and Final Fantasy molds. It's given Crystal Bears a pretty bad reputation, and yeah, it deserves some of it. But throughout this video, I hope I can portray a reason why you shouldn't just write it off as waggle moat garbage or appealing to Western markets. Hell, I'd even go so far as to say that Crystal Bears laid the groundwork for some trends that later FF games followed, if I believe that anyone who worked on an entry after 13.2 even knows what a Crystal Bears is. Because of that, I don't want to start by slandering it. That's disrespectful to the developers that dared to innovate in the series. Instead, I'd say Crystal Bears is more of a rebel to any kind of Final Fantasy we've known up to its release. It's no turn-based RPG, not a dungeon crawler, and certainly not a long 40-hour journey. If you can jump in with no preconceived notions of what makes a Final Fantasy, then you may just find one of the most unique experiences on Wii.
俺に任せろ。クリスタルベア頼むぜマジで。王国を危険にさらす者どもめ。動くな。俺はクリスタルベアラーだ。その力が災いなのだ。ここは存在と不在の狭間。
Yeah, I'm not picking a random song to use here. In the Japanese commercials, they used a Bond fucking Jovi song. Without a doubt, the weirdest musical tie-in for any Final Fantasy game, which somehow fits the narrative of Crystal Bears. As you can guess, there's some other things we need to talk about before the game itself. While I never played Crystal Bears or even watched videos about it until recently, I did hear about it during the development cycle, a dev cycle that included the worst press possible. After Crystal Chronicles 1, Square Enix said they'd make a sequel on what we then knew as Nintendo's Revolution, later renamed the Wii. In fact, it received a teaser trailer well before the 4 games we talked about last time, during the Wii's reveal, though calling it a teaser gives this clip a bit too much credit. The short CGI clip we saw in 2006 shares almost nothing with Crystal Bears' final form. Even the protagonist shown then might look familiar to y'all, since they repurposed it for Yuri in Ring of Fates, or more likely, they used Yuri as a placeholder. Only one minor implication from the trailer stuck. Crystal Bears takes place years after the original Crystal Chronicles, something we can infer from the iconic Final Fantasy airships returning after skipping the rest of the spin-off series. Due to all the discrepancies from the original trailer and the final project, we already have a good tell for how Crystal Bears travel down a turbulent development cycle. According to one IGN article, Crystal Bears should have come out with the launch of the Wii in 2006. Something I don't recall ever hearing, and when doing research, I couldn't find anything else saying that Square Enix planned for it at the Wii's release, and that initial trailer is beta as hell, so I'm thinking the writer made an honest mistake during the E3 hype. IGN employees at E3 around that period probably had hundreds of notes, and a Final Fantasy spin-off barely shown during the Wii's reveal probably wasn't his main scoop of the week. Over the next 3 years, Square Enix had a few press conferences where they intended to show off Crystal Bears, yet didn't. And I don't mean E3s or Tokyo Game Shows where they had to share time with other developers, I mean Square Enix specific parties and conferences where they didn't show or showed only a little of Crystal Bears because the team didn't feel confident yet. Telling me that even if Square never intended to release Crystal Bears at the Wii's launch in late 2006, I don't think they planned on releasing it in late 2009 either. Going back to the GameFAQs threads or reviews about Echoes of Time, and you'll see a lot of theories that the Wii port only came out to hold over Wii fans waiting on Crystal Bears. Additionally, Crystal Bears came out 1 month before Final Fantasy XIII's Japanese release date. I know the install base of the Wii didn't perfectly align with the PS3 and 360, but I still don't think Square intended to release any Final Fantasy game next to one of the most hyped up RPGs of all time. If someone said Final Fantasy in late 2009, they weren't talking about Crystal Bears. They were excited about the new numbered game and skipped over Crystal Bears. It also had next to no chance in Japan because Dragon Quest IX came out a little before it. Which, as a reminder for fellow Westerners, this is what Dragon Quest sales look like in Japan. Crystal Bears did not have a chance of coming out on top even within Square Enix's niches. Oh, but what about the small Crystal Chronicles fans, you may be asking? Well, Crystal Bears is by far the most different entry of the Crystal Chronicles series. It's no dungeon crawler, doesn't have the original art style, hell, they even changed the lead composer who worked on all 5 of the others. I'll get back to those topics later, but I feel like all of this caused Crystal Bears to fall into obscurity around release. Then, after 13 and 14 1.0 murdered the brand reputation, everyone lumped Crystal Bears in as part of Square Enix ruining Final Fantasy. Hell, until now, I guess I was a little guilty of that too. I looked at the art style, said that's no Crystal Chronicles, and never played it. Until recently, I thought of Crystal Bears as another game in Square Enix's post-FF12 Growing Pains era. Which yeah, it still goes there, that's no question, but it's not shit like 14 1.0. For who worked on it, Toshiyuki Itahana, the character designer for most of the series, directed Crystal Bears. He and his team designed Crystal Bears with primarily an American audience in mind. For those of y'all alive during the 6th generation of consoles, you may recall that many Japanese game developers tried to appeal to Western markets around here, partially because Western gaming outlets kept making jokes like this.
And we all know who will replace us. India, that billion-strong faux vegetarian tech support call-taking behemoth of a nation. Or the Chinese. But certainly not Japan, because while they may be technologically advanced and financially powerful, they're already in decline. You want proof? Here's Baten Kaito's origins.
With Crystal Bears, that resulted in a tone shift from the slow-burning, lore-filled personal journeys of the 3 dungeon crawlers to an over-the-top action film with a smart-ass protagonist. We got Final Fantasy meets Bullet Train. Honestly, the tone feels almost too modern for a game in 2009. Extremely over-the-top games only just made it to the slightly mainstream in the West with No More Heroes and Borderlands. Final Fantasy, especially the high fantasy Crystal Chronicles, going this route wasn't expected. Yet the over-the-top writing and cutscenes in recent years with Final Fantasy 16 and Strangers of Paradise makes it feel like Crystal Bears is 12 years too early for a Final Fantasy game, and 3 years too late for its very waggle-moat-centric gameplay. Crystal Bears just had the worst timing you can think of, which I'll return to way down the line. You're gonna hear me say that a lot. Crystal Bears makes it clear from the start, it ain't fucking around. The moment you select a save file, your Wii remote runs out of batteries, which in the spirit of the Wii's motion controls necessitates a motion to Walgreens for a mega pack of AA's. After that, you begin the new journey, not in a small, quaint village like the previous 3 main games, but up in an airship, or I guess more accurately, an air cruise ship with pools, bikinis, and Gatling guns. Remember back near the start when I said that as a kid I viewed Crystal Chronicles as Square's method to keep the classic fantasy setting going? Futuristic modern stories go on Sony, while high fantasy goes to Nintendo? Yeah, no, not here. Immediately by second one, Crystal Bears killed that. If we make a Final Fantasy technology scale, then CB probably goes near Final Fantasy X and 12. Still has hardcore medieval elements with very high-tech gadgetry. A big departure from the prior Crystal Chronicles that go near the most fantasy side with 2. I guess we can slot Echoes here with 16 and 1. I don't know, I spent like 30 minutes and hadn't finished 16 when I made this. Crystal Bears makes damn sure you know we jumped to a new era of the Crystal Chronicles world with a brand new protagonist named Lael, a Clavation Crystal Bearer, a rare breed of outcast born with crystals infused into their bodies. Crystals giving them unique magical superpowers that society fears. Think of them like X-Men with— No, stop. Give me like a fucking hour before we come back to that one. For Lael, he possesses gravity-based powers, which mostly translates to telekinesis. Telekinesis, you, the player, actively control with the Wii's pointer functionality, including at the very beginning when you take a Gatling gun for a rail shooter minigame. Hey, let's talk about that scenario. Lael and his non-bear Selkie partner Kais are freelancers, taking work when and where they can get it, usually with the use of Lael's telekinesis. Today, Kais accepted a job to protect the Alexis II, the air cruise ship we begin at, which, under their watch, monsters attack, leading into our rail shooter minigame, where you dive towards the Alexis and shoot down monsters. Once Lael lands, he finds 2 people on the ship's bridge, including Jagran, the high-ranking Lilty general that hired Kais. He's pissed off about a bunch of things, including not knowing that Kais brought Lael along. Jagran, along with most of society, detest bearers. He's also pissed about the second person down here, a Selkie photographer named Belle, who might have caught something she shouldn't on tape. We'll discuss them, especially these designs, more later. Right now, a mysterious portal opened up to reveal the crystallization of a bad touch. Lael, with no hesitation, drags the hand out to find not just a hand, but an entire uke. A uke also bearing crystal powers. This is a mid-Italian, but since their name goes unspoken for 3/4 of the story, Lael calls them Goldenrod, a name I won't call them because I would never use a slur against a non-binary icon. Upon arrival, a mid-Italian uses a green crystal in their possession to absorb the crystal shards, which the Alexis uses for power. Their reasoning is unknown because it's a Final Fantasy game and no one knows how to talk without riddles, but it does spark a cool fight sequences that shows off Crystal Bear's cool-ass Western style fight scenes. Just look at that stare down. The mid-Italian has the upper hand throughout the whole fight. They only leave because Square Enix Riddlespeak demanded it. On the bright side, Lael did steal that strange green crystal from a mid-Italian.
We're descending.
On the downside, Ami removed the Alexis's power to fly, meaning everyone's gonna die.
Oh no, it'll fly. I've got power. Right here!
Keep going. You're good. You're good. You're good. And stop.
Thanks to his courageous act, Lael lands the Alexis II right in front of the proud city of Alphateria, which in the time between Crystal Chronicles 1 and now has multiplied in size big time. However, almost crash landing an airship into Alphateria causes citizens and officials to spread slander and libel about Jagran, pissing him off. With his high-ranking position in jeopardy, he rehires Kais to find a mid-Italian for a shit ton of gil to clear his name, which by extension means that Lael needs to find Ami. Setting up our scenario, a cinematic-style chase where Lael needs to capture a mid-Italian. So before saying anything more about the scenario and gameplay, I'm gonna hard shift to talking about the changes to the presentation and identity of Crystal Bearers to the Crystal Chronicles series. Almost everything is different. New art style, new lead composer, new graphics, new era. As soon as Square first showed Crystal Bearers with this design, it instantly had some pushback. It's such a drastic shift that I don't think we can continue without talking about these things first. As I didn't talk about it with the other 5 games, let's start with Crystal Chronicles music as a whole, going back to the first game. That way we can ease in from the old to the new a bit easier. Potentially the most important aspect to crafting Crystal Chronicles' identity was the soundtrack composed by Kumi Tanioka. While not a hardcore gamer herself as a child, Tanioka watched her brother play some games, including Final Fantasy, which resulted in her joining Square in the late 90s, where she slowly worked her way up to becoming the lead composer for Crystal Chronicles. Most notably before then, she collaborated and led composition on a significant portion of Final Fantasy XI's soundtrack and contributed a lot to Chocobo's Dungeon 2, meaning by the time she got to work on Crystal Chronicles, she already had a hand in both the serious grand side of Final Fantasy and the light-hearted portion of it. On both of those projects, she collaborated with other composers while following the pre-existing ideas people had for Final Fantasy music. And we all know without saying, it's good music. The series is well known for that, but she was definitely working off of what Uematsu set the standard for, at least until she got the chance to lead on Crystal Chronicles, a brand new sub-series with an identity only partially in the making, meaning that whatever she composed would play a large hand in finalizing the idea of Crystal Chronicles. As CC went back to the classic high fantasy setting and had many Celtic-inspired elements like the name of the Selkies and many outfits, she ended up composing a soundtrack that made use of early instruments, particularly instruments heard more in the European Middle Ages and Renaissance like the hurdy-gurdy, lute, bagpipes, recorders, and other from that era, a style they could only record through the help of Roba Music Theater in Japan. And there's actually a funny part here. Roba Music Theater studies these old instruments and puts on performances for children even to this day. A few of their albums are on Spotify, and I'd recommend giving them a listen if you liked Crystal Chronicles music. When they started the drawing board for Crystal Chronicles soundtrack, Tanioka and Crystal Chronicles synth operator Hidenori Iwasaki saw one of their shows live, sparking the desire to get them on board to help on Crystal Chronicles, meaning one little concert basically inspired the music of 5 games. In the original Crystal Chronicles, every track uses these early instruments. Tanioka composed, Roba performed, and Iwasaki put it onto a game, with each track mixing up which instruments in each song to keep it fresh. The antiquated instruments help to invoke a feeling of age in the dungeons and towns you visit, while the upbeat compositions give a sense of childlike whimsy. You, I'm guessing, don't know these instruments, but they strum a tune of adventure, pushing you onwards. Maybe their exotic sounds pique your curiosity as much as the dungeons and intro narration. It's a soundtrack evoking adventure, mystery, and age to push you into the journey. Additionally, it breaks apart from the typical mainline Final Fantasy noise. Most numbered FF soundtracks, especially those by Uematsu, have a grander score that feels like it belongs to a high-class orchestra. It's easy to envision how these characters go on stage and act out their scenes to these tracks. Final Fantasy has warriors of light, noble heroes, and young men and women fated to save the world. They're given a grand sound meant to equal them. The orchestra matches the actors as they play their role, while the Crystal Chronicles soundtrack feels like they may come from a peasant class, something akin to a musical troupe traveling around town with cheaper, easier to carry instruments. Perhaps your caravan heard the song for just a fleeting run-in on the trail and hum it on the journey, likely forgetting the origin as their journey continues. It made Crystal Chronicles 1's soundtrack stand out from the main series and even most other games. Off the top of my head, I can't think of any other soundtracks using those same instruments in a similar way. Anyways, after the original, Tanioka composed for all 4 of the games I talked about in part 2 and mostly stayed within that wheelhouse. They have some differences from the original, like character-focused tracks in Ring of Fates. The My Life duo use orchestra instruments to give a grand royal feel, and obviously the DS and WiiWare had more limitations than the GameCube, but nothing that I feel is worth me, not a musician, rambling about rather than y'all listening yourself. The main point I want to get across is that Crystal Chronicles had a type of noise, and you could tell it apart from other games super easily. Then there's Crystal Bears. Tanioka, out. She only composed 1 song for it. Instead, Iwasaki, the guy I mentioned a minute ago, became one of the composers with Ryo Yamazaki, who had worked on Square RPGs before, just not Crystal Chronicles. With them at the helm, we get a soundtrack that I want to say is closer to a Hollywood film score, if that described how schizophrenic this music is. Easy way to describe it first, not much early instruments or Celtic sounds. Only a few tracks have those. Instead, Crystal Bears gives us, like everything else, grand theater orchestra, swingin' brass jazz, imperial marches, church choir, and even good old country fiddle music. As someone who has a deep nostalgic attachment to Crystal Chronicles 1, you'd think I'd fucking hate this. I'm supposed to look at this and say, oh wowie zowie, this is such a betrayal to my childhood, George Lucas, fuck you. Yet somehow, I kinda loved it. When it comes to giving a consistent vision for a world, yeah no, this shit's all over the place. However, so is Crystal Bearers. We are not going to experience a single consistent part of this journey, which for now, I mean very neutrally. We're no longer in the dark age of miasma, the age where the tribes couldn't advance due to some whack-ass mist impeding growth. We've already witnessed how the Lilty Kingdom of Alphateria changed, and as we go on, we'll see how the entire continent has evolved in their own ways. If we're to say that the soundtrack shift is meant to make it clear that we've made it out of the old era, then yeah, do every genre except the main one they used to focus on. Crystal Bearers rebels against what occurred before, both in Crystal Chronicles and mainline FF. For the art style, that's where I'm sure many of you have already formed an opinion with the gameplay on screen, but I'll still give it an analytical look. As I mentioned with Crystal Chronicles 1, the entire art team came off of Final Fantasy IX, which out of every Final Fantasy game may have the most divisive art style. People who love 9 absolutely love the art. Normally they say it adds to the light-hearted adventure feel of 9 and helps the characters emote with greater exaggeration, especially in the FMVs, while those that dislike 9's look usually say it ruins the more serious moments. I disagree with that, but it's not today's topic. FF9 clearly took from the Tezuka school of anime character designs with big heads, varying body types possessing unreal proportions, and a generally squishy look compared to Final Fantasy VIII and Sword of 7 that followed the realistic Tatsuo Yoshida school. Though if we bring Tatsunoko into the conversation, I guess technically Final Fantasies 1 through 6 follow it the most since Amano worked with both. That's not the point. Watch my cash in video to understand what I mean by that. On the PS1 with its very low resolution, this helped to make everyone stand out in 9, especially outside of combat with the pre-rendered backgrounds and usually slanted camera angles. While 7's my favorite of the PS1 trilogy, I can't deny that on PS1 hardware, 9 is the easiest on the eyes. Though it's ironic to say this when I'm likely using footage from the remaster. Since Crystal Chronicles 1 had the top-down view, it needed to zoom out a little bit for every player to have breathing room, so keeping 9's look was a smart move. If every party member chooses a different tribe, the top of their heads should differentiate them, and even the same tribes usually have radically different heads, such as the Lilty's various helmets, making it easy to tell who's who. Plus, the exaggerated designs lend themselves well to Crystal Chronicles' significantly lighter story than the mainline games. Then, moving to the DS, they kept those designs in order to work with the DS limitations, while the WiiWare games likely had to keep the old GameCube models to stay within the limited scope of each project, meaning they never had a chance to alter the art style, nor do I think they ever needed to. Every tribe has such an iconic design that changing them after 5 games wouldn't make sense. In fact, due to their prevalence, I'd say that how much the 4 of them appeal to you dictates how much you might like the world as a whole. Crystal Chronicles' identity is tied to the 4 tribes and their designs. However, what should happen if the game itself has a drastically different tone? Now, I certainly think the old style had some flexibility. The GameCube story and Ring of Fates go noticeably different directions. One is a casual, almost slice-of-life story about a caravan doing their job and meeting others struggling in the same plight, while Ring of Fates is a dark story about a family torn apart by the forces of evil. You could do a lot with the old style, but I'm not sure that would have fit with the Western cinema outlaw vibe of Crystal Bearers. People in the movies don't look like that. They look like this. So where does that leave it? Well, y'all have seen the screen for a while now. They redesigned absolutely everything. As they're the crux of the world, let's start with the main 4 tribes. For Klavats and Selkies, it's kinda weird. In a vacuum, they're fine. Normal, anime-looking humans. Nothing stand out. They get the job done of moving arms around and emoting their faces. About the same as any other game, which is also kind of the problem when you put them next to each other. The old art style shared that problem a tiny bit because they both look like normal humans once you change their clothes, tits, and hair around, but thanks to the exaggeration on those 3 features, it didn't matter much. You knew a Selkie from a Klavat by how they dressed and the context of where you find them. Their tribes have very different goals in life. A Selkie might rob you while wearing some furs, and a Klavat might set up shop in Alphateria with their basic boy fit. Well, in Crystal Bearers, yeah, I couldn't tell who's a Selkie or who's a Klavat without story context. A change I'm not particularly a fan of. I guess you could argue that this states how people of other geographic backgrounds aren't too different from each other. You never know where someone comes from, and you should judge them by the inside. Some mushy shit like that. Though it doesn't come across well when the Lilties and Ukes are still weird looking. Bottom line is that the redesigns homogenize the 2 tribes more than I'd like. None of the major Selkies even wear fur, and Lael's the only important Clavat in the game. We barely get to see that tribe. I guess they thought it'd even out because he's the main character. Anyways, for the Ukes, honestly not much to say. Since they were the lankiest tribe in the original, I think they translated the best to Crystal Bears. They lost the pointy boobs and animal characteristics, but we kinda have a plot reason for that I'll get to later. Their mysterious elements from before take center stage later, so we can deduce secrets of that conundrum together as we get there. Or we can question the mysteries of what the fuck happened to Lilties right now. From looking at the name and design of the original, most people can figure out quickly that Lilties should kinda look like a lily flower, hence the petal-like bits on their head. You can also read that since they have a small stature, their heads have an onion shape, and they're mainly physical attackers, Lilties reference the Onion Knights from Final Fantasy III. Going off of the veggie aspect, Crystal Bears shows us that the Lilties have evolved drastically between Crystal Chronicles 1 and now, meaning we have big boys, wide guys, old guys, and most of them have Dr. Seuss faces. It's a radical departure. Like, Jagron, he's a Liltie. Put him next to the Black Knight from Crystal Chronicles 1, and it's almost like two different species. You get used to them, but man, they kinda uggo. Just straight up, I think they're less pleasing to look at than the old design. I believe the point of this change was to make them more plant-like. Not every flower grows the same way, so not every Liltie grows to the same size. Older Lilties look rotten like an old vegetable, and strong guards have a green color since unripe veggies are usually pretty stiff. It's a cool idea in concept. Now, while I'm sounding a bit negative towards the look here for the Lilties, Clavats, and Selkies, all the designs are neat in a vacuum of Crystal Bears. It's a different game and can have something different. As a single player game with one playable character, it doesn't necessitate differentiating them as fast. Back in the 3 dungeon crawlers, their designs and outfits needed to indicate what job they somewhat represented. Ukes were mages, Selkies were thieves, Lilties were warriors / onion knights, and Clavats were all-arounders. You needed to get a grasp on this before choosing your character through their designs and minimal lore given in the manual. But when you get down to it, Crystal Bears doesn't need to do that. You only play as Lael. You don't need to know Clavat's farm until you find them farming, and learning that Selkies follow their independent mantra around the quarter mark doesn't impede any decisions you make early on. And even if it's not completely clear at the start, you still get clues about those tribe attributes at the beginning. Belle's performing independent journalism, Jagron's an asshole, and Amiditelian's performing magic. It's not put in your face like the original game, but we can still see the pieces of these tribes' identity during the first act. It's just, when compared to the rest of Crystal Chronicles, especially in retrospect, you can't ignore the dissonance. On top of the art style difference, you'll notice that the cutscenes have also taken a turn. All of the Crystal Chronicles games before now had either basic cutscenes or cheaply made ones. It's clear that the budget for cutscenes and FMVs didn't go towards Crystal Chronicles. Take a look at any of Square Enix's other games between 2003 and 2009 to guess where they stationed the fancy cutscene guys. Crystal Bears changes that. While still only having 2 or 3 full CG FMVs, it has really good cutscene direction. The camera never dawdles on the same subject for too long, even in talking head sequences. Anything you ever need to see is seen, from the actions characters perform to the minor props they use. On top of that, the camera tries its best to use all of the screen real estate afforded for shots that would be breathtaking if made on a stronger system. Like this shot later of a Amiditelian under a crystal. We see light emanating from the center, their slender body right under, and the long path we need to take to reach them. We also observe many real fight scenes within cutscenes, which Final Fantasy hadn't actually done too often by this point, at least not to this degree. They made most of the big action scenes into boss fights, which in all fairness you probably should do that in a video game, but hey, it's an interesting watch in Crystal Bears. It presses in CB's action film vibe, while Final Fantasy up until now blocked most cutscenes more like a stage play. The main games had only just stopped using pre-rendered backgrounds with 11 and 12, so it's not like they ever had the choice. Because of that, you could see the shift with 12 and a complete change to cutscene direction by 13 in the main games, but Crystal Bears technically came out before 13, though obviously it's not as impressive. Anyways, the main point I want to get across is that Crystal Bears, from an art standpoint, barely feels like the same world. Besides proper nouns here and there, the Crystal Chronicles identity is almost completely gone, which is why I stressed don't go into this with expectations, as once you get past how different everything looks and feels, you can appreciate what's here. A perspective I found easier to reach today when Square's shelved the sub-series for almost 15 years. I can see the whole picture of 5 games like this and 1 game like that, while 15 years ago, I grunted at the trailers. I didn't see the Crystal Chronicles I knew, and thus had an aversion. Now I can respect what it's doing. Look at the fantasy Crystal Bears earned in its title, and the final before it, because CB's world actually follows more in line with the mainline numbered games of the time than the rest of Crystal Chronicles. Back to the idea of high fantasy on Nintendo and future on Sony, that idea wasn't just broken by Crystal Bears. Final Fantasy Tactics A2 and 12 Revenant Wings already came out on DS, and those are not high fantasy. But still, the big title that broke this idea that I had in my head was Crystal Bears. Now obviously when you get to the nitty gritty, almost every Final Fantasy, including 1 and 9 that Crystal Chronicles borrows from, had a mix of sci-fi and high fantasy. Ring of Fate's Crystal Chronicles and the WiiWare duo going straight fantasy is actually an outlier in the franchise. But there's sort of a scale to it, and like I said before, I'd place Crystal Bears right around 12 or 10. Common folk have high-tech gadgets juxtaposed to their fantasy world of knights and castles. Everyday citizens see hologram screens, airships, industrial machines, and all of what you'd expect from a future-ish setting. Crystal Bears is undeniably closer to the sci-fi side than high fantasy. Not that it's bad to do that, just different from Crystal Chronicles, which, like the music, is the point. Goes far away from what they already portrayed to make it clear that the world changed. You don't have to say you like the change. I personally still think that the eras of prior titles have room to explore, but I do want us to talk about Crystal Bears for what it's doing rather than what it could have done. And what it's doing is respectfully rebelling against the original setting. I mean, setting-wise, it's not even different from Final Fantasy as a whole. In fact, you might say it's closer than the other Crystal Chronicles titles. It's just that Crystal Bears' direction brings us to a better question that I'll loop back to near the end of the video. What is a Final Fantasy game? A question already asked a lot by the time of Crystal Bears' release with 12 and 11, even more a few months later after 13 and 14, and still thrown around online today. Almost always, it's a question used for someone to stealthily say, I didn't like this one. If you play the numbered FF games sequentially, you know that there's little shared between them, and once you throw in spin-offs and games releasing well after Crystal Bears, the question gets murkier. I think there's definitely a feel for what a Final Fantasy game is, which varies by person to person. When you get down to it, the actual answer is that Final Fantasy is whatever Square Enix wants to title Final Fantasy, but for me, Crystal Bears is one of the furthest from my idea. With that comment, I think we can actually talk about the game. Now that we reached Alphateria, we're introduced to the core gameplay of Crystal Bears, a system that no other Final Fantasy game, spin-off or mainline, has ever done, mostly because it's wrapped heavily around the Wii Remote's pointer and motion controls. It's likely why we won't see a port anytime soon, and why I needed to play it on the Wii U. Yes, I know there's third-party hardware you can use for emulators, I just didn't want to wait for the shipment. Anyways, let's start by looking at the screen here. Crystal Bears goes full 3D with an over-the-shoulder camera angle, or I guess more often an under-the-ass angle.
Nice.
While Lael moves, dodges, and auto-jumps like any other action game, your main exploits involve his telekinesis with the Wii's pointer. Point at something, press B, double-check your Wii safety strap, fling the Wii remote, and there you go. You did something. This is the basis of every puzzle, combat scenario, and most minigames in Crystal Bears. The only thing you do without telekinesis is open treasure chests, and some of those even require you to pick up and throw them first. It leads to an experience that I expected to run thin near the end, which after 3 hours it definitely did on my wrist. However, in terms of mechanics and events, I never felt that way. Without a doubt, the nicest thing I can say about Crystal Bears is that it doesn't make you do the same thing twice in the main campaign. Every 10 minutes, it throws something new at you with different enemies, puzzles, or minigames, and it's gonna be fun to reach that stuff. After all, Crystal Chronicles was the main outlet Final Fantasy used for action-oriented titles at the time, so it made sense to throw in as many actions as they could think of. Since it abused the hell out of that waggle stick, it also helps maintain the sub-series knack for innovation. With that funny Wiimote and nunchuck in hand, you feel like you're on a wacky journey, one where nothing is set in stone, which is why I really emphasize at the start, do not go into Crystal Bears with any expectation. It is ever changing and we'll have a lot to go over, but nothing too crazy yet. Here at Alphateria, we dick around while Kais figures out the next job, which for now means find Belle, the Selkie photographer from earlier, during which we absorb a good idea of how the world has changed through searching Alphateria. A very long time has passed since the original game. I've seen some unofficial sources say 1,000 years, and I've headcanoned the same, because unless it's hidden in some flavor text I missed, there's no direct mention of the age of miasma. Worries of that time have long been swept into history books, which, at some point, led to strife between the tribes again. Specifically, the Lilties went back to imperial conquesting, which is why Alphateria is so fucking big. Legitimately gave me vibes of bigger FF towns like Lindblum or Esther City. A stark contrast from these small villages in Crystal Chronicles 1 that fit only a few families each. The Liltie Empire's conquest, similar to the pre-miasma age, has shaped the circumstances of the other three tribes. For the Selkies, they secluded themselves even further away into one giant boat. Everyone in universe calls this boat the Selkie Guild. A group of Selkies, and by that I mean almost all of the ones we see in game, are members of this guild. A guild which I feel like made the Selkies tighter knit than in prior games. Crystal Chronicles 1 and even the DS Duo to a lesser extent stressed how Selkies lived by their independent and free-spirited mantra. The age of miasma leaves few people to trust, so only the few living in Liuta have any trust in people, though the only people they trusted were other Selkies. In Crystal Bears, they seem closer with each other at the cost of trusting other tribes, especially Lilties, way less. I really can't blame them though. Crystal Chronicles and the My Life games made it seem like everyone would come together, and then at some point the Lilties went back to their old conquesting ways. Compare that dingy, broken down boat to Alphateria, and you see the difference. Alphateria is a high-class kingdom, while the Selkies don't even have a flat 180-degree floor to sleep on. If we want to throw a little extra meaning in it, the boat could also represent the loss of freedom. In the Age of Miasma, the Selkies had as much freedom as the Lilties since everyone shared the same impediments. Miasma, ironically, kept the tribe safe from Liltie control, while today, when most of the continent is controlled by the Liltie Empire, they've lost any free seas to sail. Their boat had nowhere to go, and thus sank into its port. Moving to the Clavats, I have way less to say. The Lilties subjugated them into farm work in a manner seeming more like indentured servitude than cooperation, but Clavats as a tribe have no story significance at all throughout the whole game. They're the normal NPCs and Lael's a Clavat, but that's it. Then finally we have the Ukes. Lilties wiped out their tribe in an all-out war some few hundred years ago, hence the confusion caused by the appearance of a mid-Italian. Their entire existence, both from a modern and historical standpoint, is lost to most normal citizens. To any non-historian in universe, only 3 tribes exist. This mystery of the Ukes drives most of the middle of the game, so we'll come back to them later. Interestingly, Crystal Bears presents a complete shakeup to the tribal hierarchy based upon the pre-miasma age's trajectory, rather than how the ending of Crystal Chronicles 1 and the My Life games implied things would go. Due to the lack of a shared goal or enemy, the tribal unity fell apart over the centuries. Lilties thrive with fancy kingdoms and rich, pompous clothes at the price of every other tribe. Because of that, I don't respect them, and we're gonna fuck with them for a bit. So I feel like around the 7th generation of consoles, we started seeing developers market games along the lines of you can interact with everything you see. The games in my head include Skyrim and Metal Gear Rising. With games on Wii that did this, it had the obvious extra benefit of you physically interacting with it. Crystal Bears, it tries to do that. You can pick up the ugly Liltie guards, treasure, or even the falling steel balls that were hung up by a tiny string? Who fucking designed this room? The most you can do here is hold anything you see over your head by flicking the Wiimote up, or throwing them wherever the game decides they land by flicking sideways. For anyone that enjoys a handful of mischief in their games, it's kind of a genius way to tutorial you. It never stops you for an explanation, and this first little room nudges you to test your powers on everything from living beings, stationary objects, and objects affected by physics. Pretend there's like 5 quotation marks around the word physics. Now that we have the basics of that, the following room teaches us about Lael's telekinetic grapple hook, right after Stiltskin floats in to nudge us at using it. Hi Stiltskin, don't know how you grew arms, but whatever. You learned the grapple hook a lot less gracefully because that's it, but hey, now we can go chase after Belle. Or a ferret, fuck it, why not? Lael tears up the street because a ferret stole the crystal he stole from a mid-Italian that rightfully belongs to him, and in the process, introduces us to an important Dr. Seuss reject. Seussical here reminds Lael, codeword for tells the player, that bears shouldn't go around using their powers wherever they want. It's strictly outlawed, and he could be locked. No. I beat the DLC already, go away. We're having a slow world-building talk without interrupt.
Arrest that woman!
Jesus Christ. Yeah, so here's when CB's chase movie type pacing kicks into full gear. We've stepped around town for about 15 minutes at my extremely leisurely pace, and already Belle's shown back up with guards on her tail who have the objective of arresting both her and Lael, leading to not just an escape sequence, but an escape minigame, meaning between the intro rail shooter, ship driving, and this chocobo meet and flick action, we've had 3 minigames in the first 30 minutes. Additionally, capturing the rodent earlier was kinda minigame-esque, so you could debate 4. When I said there's something new every 10 minutes, I meant it. It's to the point where I'd argue Crystal Bears is 50% minigame collection. Now, to be fair to Crystal Bears, of the 3 we've done, only the ship driving wasn't that fun. It's also the only one of these to not use pointer controls, which is a theme we'll notice going forward. Who knows, maybe I actually enjoy cramping my wrist with Wii Remote stuff, like how the heroes enjoy cramping their asses. Now that they've escaped Alphataria's domain, it's time for the heroes to make it back to any form of society. Or at least that's their plan if we didn't find ourselves hot on the heels of a mid-Italian again. In the process, finally experience combat. Structure-wise, for the battles, Crystal Bears doesn't follow the dungeon crawler's design of having a set amount of enemies in every room, or the mainline game's random encounter system. Instead, we have what I guess is best compared to Chrono Trigger's system. We have locations on each map where once you pass by, you're forced into a battle. But now I want y'all to think about something. Did I ever mention if Lael has a sword, a gun, or even just the ability to punch something? Well, I didn't mention it because he doesn't have those. Grips McGee touches his way through combat differently depending on the location, monster's biology, and surrounding objects. He does clearly fight himself, though it's less direct than a usual Final Fantasy protagonist. Our first encounter here is with a group of goblins that popped out of a mini miasma hole, which is a neat callback to the original monster lore they never dwell on. For this battle, we have 2 choices. We can either grab the goblins to throw them at each other, dealing small damage to multiple enemies, or grab the rocks and throw them at goblins individually for bigger damage. It's the most basic idea because it's the start of the game, but it slowly grows into increasingly complex scenarios. For example, the following horde fight a little later has skeletons and wolves in a desert. Here you could slowly try to throw cactuses at each of the wolves and skeletons while they dodge you, or you can stop the skeletons first and throw their leftover bones to distract the wolves, since dogs love their bones. You have multiple options for these battles, in turn requiring you to get creative. Creativity you'll need because you have a time limit for every battle. Once the time runs out, the miasma portal goes away and you don't get any of the rewards for fighting. Though you probably can't tell that because the time limit is hidden, which is kind of fucking lame. It makes pacing your fights difficult, especially on a first run around. I didn't even realize I had a limit until later when I encountered a battle across a large open field with tons of goblins and bombs that I had no way of killing one by one. Now, on its own, this is a cool fight. Rather than wasting time by killing everyone individually, it inspires you to trigger the bombs to explode so they kill all of the goblins in the area. But I didn't know that until midway through my first attempt, resulting in an eventual timeout. And when that happens, all of the monsters recede into the miasma portal, then starting another unseen timer for when you can try again. Meaning I had to just dick around until Crystal Bears said I could go for a second attempt. I don't have an issue with fights having a timer, but having another timer for when I can try again is stupid. I technically could move on and come back later, very few fights in the game are mandatory, but winning individual encounters for the first time rewards you with more health, which at such an early point in the game, I didn't want to skip out on. And I think this lack of a real reset button for encounters puts a blemish on what's already a pretty flawed combat system. I want to stress again, Lael's actual actions don't change from what we've already seen. He picks up, throws, dodges, and every so often grapple hooks to something or someone. He himself never does anything different, and since that translates to you flinging the Wii remote, you physically feel the fatigue as well. Additionally, the camera fights against you constantly since you have to use the Wii D-pad to control it, and the dated Wii motion sensors don't offer perfect accuracy with your IRL physical actions. If you shake with a slightly diagonal arc, it's a complete crapshoot on if Lael picks up the subject or throws it to the side. Depending on how you feel about that, you may not like the experience as a whole. In fact, I bet more than half of you won't like that idea. I myself took a few forced breaks to stretch my hands. If you're jumping in to see how Lael himself changes during combat, you're looking at a very wrong game. The appeal here is how different each fight is from each other due to the enemies and location, with the ideas in earlier battles evolving into the later ones. Like the fight I mentioned with the bombs or the dog bones. Unless it's hidden somewhere, Crystal Bears never 100% replicates those encounters. Sure, we see those enemies again, but the formations and locations change them significantly. Like here, you're fighting skeletons again, but next to the skeletons are these Ahriman variants which, if you grab them, breathe fire on opposing enemies, changing the best course of action from throw bones to distract dogs to grab floaty boys to breathe fire. Then here's another one where you fight a behemoth king throwing giant boulders at you. You could throw the bomb enemies at him and stop the king quickly, but then you won't have easy ammunition against the other tough enemies in the area. So here you need to wait for his boulders so that you can use those against him to save the bombs for later, or what I'm realizing now, use the boulders on the other enemies while the king is still alive, so I have that ammunition at the ready. Though that does put me at risk of this shit. See, this is what I want to show with Crystal Bear's combat. It's not complex, but you have tons of ways to interact with the external factors. Crystal Bears understands that every little piece of your surroundings changes the experience of a battle, which motivated me to fight every mook I found. I'm not going to say I loved the combat overall, but I did want to see what it had to offer, both for the experience of fighting and to see how they changed Final Fantasy staple monsters. It's interesting to see them with this drastic art style shift. One of my favorites is the new Iron Giant. He's absolutely massive with a more monstrous look and a giant cog on his back that you need to hit first to wake him up. It's rad as hell with the ensuing fight taking me a long time. The strat I eventually went with was picking up a coral and using their electricity powers to kill the first Iron Giant, then try and see if I can deal with the second one with all the shit on the floor. Like, Crystal Bear's combat has major flaws. I'm not arguing the series needs to go back to this, but the uniqueness did have me engaged enough to finish the pretty short story, plus the fact I had already outlined the first video for the series when I started playing. Really, the biggest flaw outside of what I said comes from how you just don't actually fight very often. Yeah, I guess it is pretty easy to make battles unique when it only accounts for maybe a fourth of the 12-hour game. For the most part, you perform various odd jobs through minigames and watch the story unfold. After their rough fall, Lael and Belle travel into an ancient tomb with brand new myths about crystals and the 4 tribes. A myth which, if taken literally, contradicts the DS game, so I'm glad they only call it a myth in-game, letting me reinterpret it once we get back to this later. According to that myth, there existed only 4 crystals in the beginning. Those 4 crystals founded the crystal principle, and with it, humanity. Upon the making of humans, they each created 1 tribe, giving us the 4 we have in Crystal Chronicles.
Belle! Belle, look out!
And it's a good thing Belle almost died there because I have no clue how to justify this myth with Ring of Fate's plot yet, so now I have more time to think. Lael grapples through the ruins to find an exit and face a strangely unique rendition of the Demon Wall from FF4, all the while Belle annoyingly makes sure we know that every treasure chest is empty and there's not a single bit of treasure here.
Hey, this chest is empty.
Yeah, thanks for yelling it, whatever. Eventually the two find themselves face to face with a Mid-Italian again. Ami does more Square Enix vague speak with a blue crystal object behind them. Lael legit has no patience for that bullshit.
This one's in the bag.
Though of course that won't do anything substantial when we're not even an hour into the story. The Mid-Italian gets back up for a cool, non-playable fight scene where they steal the green crystal back from Lael to transfer its energy into the big blue crystal behind them, claiming they needed to do as such to incite a resurrection. However, while escaping, a Mid-Italian adds that they can only fulfill this goal if they find 2 more of those green crystals, which for any old average player portrays how many of these items we've got to find before the end game, but for you, specifically, the person that watched 3 hours worth of Crystal Chronicles Retrospective before this, additionally tells us that a Mid-Italian's trying to resurrect the Yuke tribe, which is a neat way of putting Crystal Chronicles fans ahead of Lael. A random person using the word resurrection without proper sentence structure around it can mean anything to Lael, but for us, who have noticed the strange lack of a staple Crystal Chronicles tribe, we figure out quickly that they mean resurrecting the Yukes, adding sympathy to a Mid-Italian long before we've reached the part where they properly explain this goal to the main characters. Now that we know Ami's goal, chasing them becomes structured cleaner. We need to find the green crystal before they do. Meaning the first thing we need to do is figure out their location. Yeah, never mind. We, the players at least, already know where both crystals reside. Belle stole one during the trip in the ruins, while keen-eyed players might remember that Ferret Chaser had the other attached to her chest. Though Lael has to figure this out for himself, and honestly the way he does it is extremely amusing. For the first one, he goes to visit the most Goron-looking Cid of all time, who explains everything related to these items. These items are the crystal idols. As we've already surmised, there are 3 of them, and the Lilty royal family consider them family heirlooms, with one kept on the royal family at all times, meaning Lael's gonna need to get close to the Princess of Alphateria at some point. And in this same scene, we, the player, learn that Seussical is Princess Altea Sol Alphateria. Basically here just to remind us she has the 3rd idol, and maybe she has some trust in Lael. So if you want a girl's trust, just go fucking catch their ferret. Then for the second one, Lael realizes its location after he receives a letter from Kais. Kais lets him know that originally, the dungeon we were at with Belle had 2 crystal idols in it. A few weeks ago, one of them went missing, which we can presume was when a Mid-Italian stole it. Then, when he starts to think about how he never saw a second one, he remembers Belle screaming about the empty chest, and it hits him that she already stole the second one. It's such a hilarious scene for those that paid attention up until now. And upon going through my footage, I was smacking my head when rewatching the dungeon section. Belle found it really quickly in one cutscene, and then she constantly yells about the lack of anything during gameplay to throw off Lael. It's such a genius scene, especially after they had already bantered a lot by now, which I think kind of segues us into another topic I want to get into. Since almost everyone has had an introduction by this point, I can move into an aspect of Crystal Bears which really shocked me: the quality of its characters. Besides Ring of Fates, the series had next to no heavily focused on characters that went through big story arcs. We had Charlotta and the Undead Princess in Echoes of Time and the fellow caravanners in the original, but the former was played for laughs during a majority of the journey, while the latter wasn't even full stories that we observed. We bumped into people during the middle of their stories, and maybe we had an impact on them. Additionally, Ring of Fates had a fairly by-the-books cast with the newly orphaned hero, wise mentor, comic relief, the girl, hey wait a minute, I think I know this structure. Characters and their growth took a major backseat in prior Crystal Chronicles games so that you, and theoretically your friends, could self-insert easier. Buckethead Lilty didn't go on that journey, you did. Crystal Bears, as a 99% single-player adventure, throws that aside to give us a genuinely, and sometimes a tad ironically, likable cast of modern-feeling characters with full voice acting. Voice acting which is pretty high quality for a game of this budget. They got mostly well-known cast like Laura Bailey and David Vincent, though funnily enough, there's a few quirks here. Laura Bailey used the pseudonym Ella Dietz in her credit, as did John Snyder, the voice for a character we haven't gotten to, who went by the name John DeMusi, though he also just used his E Honda voice for the whole game. He plays a loud fat man, so I guess he decided not to fix what already worked. Similarly, Jagron's voiced by Michael McConaughey, the same actor who played Seth in Street Fighter, meaning every time he opened his mouth, I only heard Seth. Especially when Jagron talks about vague ideas of power or the crystal engine. It made me like him a little more in English, to be honest.
You have no value or purpose.
I think the strangest casting though is with Lael himself. In both English and Japanese, they hired dudes with next to no credits, which you wouldn't expect when everyone else is, I'm not gonna say famous because it's voice acting in America, no one's actually famous, but they're well-known actors within their space. I guess it kind of pairs in with what I've said about removing expectations, because in both languages, they bring this character to life for me. Lael's born with an absolutely insane power, one that very few people possess, and he knows he's hot shit because of it. Yeah, sure, a lot of people disrespect him for it. Everyone, even his friends, call him Bearer more often than his name, and the police want him arrested for using his powers, but how do they expect to catch him? He's got superpowers that lets him escape easily, pick up chicks, and decimate monsters. A normal Lilty guard can't stop this man. Even one time, Lilty cavalry have a few dozen guards ready to shoot Lael outside of Cid's workshop, and instead of having any worry about it, he casually walks outside to take them out in an instant. They're dealt with so quickly, we don't even see it. Camera cuts away from Lael, and once he's back in focus, the problem's dealt with. No one can stop this guy, and his confidence in his power shapes the relationships he has with everyone else in the story. While most of society shuns bearers, Lael's never confrontational with the characters that treat him with respect. If you say bearer endearing rather than bearer derogatory, he's cool with you. If they help Lael, Lael will help them rather than making some kind of scene. It's a you scratch his back, he'll scratch yours mentality. For example, when you first meet Sid, Lael needs all that crystal idol information, while Sid needs help getting a new machine working. Since Lael showed up at the right time with his crystal powers, he just does some crystal bearing and saves Clive 2 hours of side questing. Speaking of Sid, having him again was nice. This is the first time we've had Sid in a Crystal Chronicles title, unless you count a Moogle named Mog Sid in My Life as a King, who pilots this very unimportant airship that I completely forgot about until right now while editing the video. And God, I missed him. For as many ways that Crystal Bears strays from Final Fantasy norms, it finds some ways to adhere even more than the other Crystal Chronicles games. We run around with and race chocobos often, one of the few bosses is against Bahamut, and Sid here adheres to the very stereotypical Sid role from older numbered games. He's old, rotund, lets out a big old chuckle, and invented both the airship from the start of the story and the crystal-powered engines entirely. I loved his inclusion and his relationship with Lael. I feel it adds to Lael's street-smart type of persona. Sid, while retired by the start of the story, is well respected by the Lilty army who want Lael locked up, making his amicable relationship with Sid show how as long as someone's chill, Lael can get down with them. In fact, Lael probably wins for chillest FF protagonist, though that's a really small competition, only Bartz and Zidane really compete. Then on the other side, we've got characters that confront Lael more than help, like Jagron and somewhat Bell. For Jagron, he and the Lilty army hunt him down during the whole game since they don't want to bear on the loose. Doesn't matter if Jagron hired Kais and Lael works with Kais, Jagron seems to want Lael straight up dead, and tons of the game is spent avoiding him, including a stealth minigame on a train, which I found hilarious. Lael's forced to hide in these little carts pushed by the Moogles and crawl around, while doing everything in his power to avoid getting caught, showing a contrast between Jagron's stiff, serious nature to Lael's knack for getting out of situations with indirect creative methods. Kinda like in the combat, though I think my favorite relationship in the game overall is how he works off of Bell. Out of all the characters we meet, she cares about the whole crystal bearers and mid-Italian resurrection junk the least. She only stays around Lael when it helps her, and even during those scenarios, she tries her best to lose the dude. Probably the most ridiculous part is when Lael first meets up with her after deducing she has the crystal idol. Belle stopped off at a beach to relax with her friends, giving Lael a chance to steal the crystal from her bag. Or at least that's what we assume before Square Enix reminds us this series is anime as fuck and adds in a very, I swear to God, this is super justified, of a minigame. Yeah, that's right. If you thought Keijo made this shit out of nowhere, then you're sorely mistaken. Buy a copy of Dead or Alive Extreme before you try conversing with me again, you uncultured gaijin. So this isn't the worst thing I've ever played for my girlfriend to walk in on. She was there when I played Galgun shirtless on a hot Texas day, but it's not the content itself that's the issue here. Playing the minigame is next to impossible, making everything feel weird. It wants you to use Lael's telekinesis to bump Belle's butt into an advantageous position, pick her back up if she's falling, shake her ass further if she misses, and stop stray volleyballs from touching her. But there's next to no sense of physics at all here. If you interact with one of the pieces on screen, it resets to a hard program position. It should if you interact with that part. There's no flow at all here. Because of that, I touched anything in the vicinity of these half-naked meatless bikini babes until eventually the game said I won, at which point Belle accuses Lael of pervery for looking through her stuff, seemingly not because she actually cares, but to have a diversion for getting him off of her ass. It's kind of cool how this works too, because Lael can't fight back without making a huge scene. Everyone on the beach learned he was a bearer, so if he does anything wrong, he'll get in serious social trouble. Not physically, obviously. I mean, in what world could regular citizens beat magic crystal bears? So yeah, I love most of the characters. Are they in my top 10 FF casts? Probably not, that's a high bar to cross. Lael at least earns himself a special place in my heart next to other strange FF spin-off protagonists like Jack of Paradise and Benjamin Quest. The way Lael interacts with everyone so carefree just makes him for me. Once Lael learns of the two crystal idols, he has a few run-ins with the rest of the main cast. Immediately after leaving Sid, Kai summons Lael to a Clovation vineyard to look for Mid-Italian, where, before their meetup, Lael notices Kais fraternizing with High Commander Jagron, seemingly to get a good deal for himself and Lael. Although maybe Kais shouldn't trust the dude that's spending half the conversation saying how fucking badly he wants his best friend dead. Right after that, the duo take 5 steps to find a Mid-Italian right fucking there in a wine cellar, perhaps facing their own demons, leading to a very, okay, yeah, I guess. chase sequence in the wine cellar that very abruptly leads to a forest and then into a trippy void-like room. In here, a Meditelian finally explains part of their plan to Lael about the Yuke tribe and shows off a strange red crystal shard, an item that should set off the radar and Ring of Fates players' heads, even if it's not really related. A Meditelian says that the red crystal is throwing off the balance of the crystal principle, and finally reveals their bearer power, the power of summoning. At least that's how they describe it. It's more like portal creation since they can send themselves through the summoning as well, though I guess they wanted to use an iconic FF keyword that's surprisingly gone unused in all of Crystal Chronicles. And to ease into the parts, they summon Bahamut. The battle itself serves little purpose beyond making Lael look cool. Meditelian escapes because the game hasn't gone on long enough for us to finish misunderstanding each other, leaving Lael and Kais at the Selkie Guild where they split up. Vigali, the Selkie leader, doesn't get along with Kais since Vigali's, kinda rightfully, racist towards Lilties, while Kais has a pretty good standing with the Liltie army. So Kais, the scab that he is, heads to Alphateria to research the idols, while Lael stays to talk to Vigali in hopes of gaining information on a Meditelian. He doesn't get much because he fucked up and brought up Sid, so Vigali shoos Lael away for him to go through the beach episode and then takes the train stealth sequence back to town, where he has a few talking head scenes with every major character, serving the purpose to see that Kais has enlisted in the Liltie army. The princess tells Lael her dad is sick, and Vigali and Sid decided to make some fucking trains together. Through that train, we can finally meet up with a Meditelian again to experience the big chase sequence. Lael and Kais follow a Meditelian towards a church, where they additionally find Belle and her crystal idol that she still refuses to give up. While a Meditelian and Lael focused on trying to get the crystal idol from Belle, another character, Blaze, started a fire across the whole monastery. As you may expect, it leads to a boss fight, but I gotta stop to talk about Blaze for a minute because he's really weird in the grand scheme of the story. So every other main character serves an important purpose to the narrative. Lael's the Clavat hero with crystal inside of him, Sid's the Liltie mechanic giving us help kinda from the inside, a Meditelian's the Yuke trying to save their tribe, etc, etc. But Blaze, Before this point, we've seen a dude in a blue robe every so often, with Lael causing an issue for them. It's during shots that go by so fast with so little focus that I didn't even notice them until my New Game Plus run. So he himself, the body Blaze, is not out of nowhere. He has a grudge against Lael for very recent actions. But then he unrobes himself to reveal that he's not only a crystal bearer with fire powers, he's also Lael's old partner and mentor. We can tell they ended on bad terms since Lael's dismissive of everything Blaze says, but his actual relationship with Lael isn't what I want to talk about. He implies a long litany of past journeys he went on with Lael, and I almost have to wonder, was this meant to be shown at some point? Crystal Bears had the development issue, so I wouldn't be shocked if that was cut, but more than that, I wonder if Blaze was meant to set up some kind of prequel game. Crystal Bears starts well into Lael's life journey with experience using his powers, a strong friendship with Kais, knowledge of the world around him, and given that the dev team spent a very long time on changing the status quo and art style of the Crystal Chronicles world, I have to assume they planned more journeys for Lael. Maybe this was meant as their new hope, the story that you can expand on by going forward or backward. It's a very big idea that I'll come back to towards the end of the video, because talking about it with Blaze has little meaning when he himself does next to nothing outside of burning this church and the ensuing boss fight where you throw Virgin Marys at him. That entire fire situation strikes fear back into Belle, so she gives us the crystal idol, letting her not deal with this shit any longer. Afterwards, we chase a Meditelian into a tall, rundown mechanical tower, at which point the big bad is revealed. To only minimal shock, High Commander, I want to fucking murder Lael and the Yuke, Jagron is an evil crystal bearer, able to turn anything he touches into crimson crystals with a crystal right hand. A power he gained after a freak accident gone wrong. Since he's not naturally a bearer and he's literally creating new crystals, he's upset the crystal principle. By the way, he killed Blaze, if any of you care. With a cartoonish escape in the most boring Crash Bandicoot type chase minigame of all time, a Meditelian saves Lael from Jagron, which by Lael's own respectful rules means he's got to help a Meditelian out, much to the chagrin of Kais, who at this point needs to take Jagron's orders. The order to kill Lael, though at this point there's a scene that I really love. To avoid Jagron's order to kill him, the duo perform some fancy sign language motions to fool the Liltie guards, though in the process label Lael as not just a petty crook, but a full-on hostile for attacking an Imperial guard.
Now, fire!
I really love the direction on this scene. I want to stress how good cutscenes are in Crystal Bears. It doesn't feel like Final Fantasy, especially the games by then, but I'm just amused the entire time. We can tell by their facial and body expressions that this isn't the first time the duo have done something like this. They're well experienced in working together, again kind of playing to that point about maybe there could have been a prequel. Anyways, after the two bears escape into a portal, they wind up in an alternate dimension. The dimension which the Ukes have lived in for the past few centuries, which means fun exposition time. First off, we can clearly see while walking around that the Ukes aren't actually dead as we assumed. They're alive and well inside of this pocket dimension, as the resurrection isn't actually about reviving Ukes themselves, but reviving their crystal. Recall the crystal myth from earlier. It stated that 4 crystals created the 4 tribes, with each of them presiding over their own tribe. In the era of Crystal Bears, only 4 crystals exist and are classified as such. So every crystal shard we've seen came from the broken Uke crystal. And if a tribal crystal is destroyed, then that tribe ceases to exist. Meaning in the case of the Ukes, the Lilties didn't slaughter them. Well, okay, they slaughtered a lot of them, but the main point is that they destroyed the Uke crystal, banishing them to this interdimensional rift. Only by finding every shard to the Uke crystal can a mid-Italian bring the Ukes back to the main world, something only they can do because the crystal principle granted them the portal power. Now, for how this ties into the other 5 games, I think I can see what they're doing. Again, get ready for Roman's headcanon. This is not straight up said in the English material. Since the first game, every crystal was part of the Great Crystal. Pieces broke off due to the meteorite before the Miasma Age, and save points lay in a few spots during Ring of Fates, but every shard we see did break from the Great Crystal, meaning that every crystal was, at one point, a single whole. Even as implied by the crystal principle, the amount of crystal resource never changes. It only changes form. That's why the destruction of the Uke crystal has set it off, as well as Jagron creating new crystals. With Echoes of Time, we can justify that maybe after Larkishus used the crystals as a resource, their energy floated out in the ether and eventually made its way back to the crystal the heroes planted at the end of the game, thus making the Great Crystal again, which broke before the GameCube journey. Additionally, if we're gonna say that disrupted the crystal principle, then maybe, big stretch here, that principle made Charlotta a bearer to correct the status quo, explaining why she could put her soul in the cat and regrow blue crystals. I wouldn't think too hard on that one since different teams, and I don't even believe that too much myself. Anyways, when it comes to justifying the whole creation myth about the 4 tribes being made by crystals and the existence of the crystals dictating if the tribes exist, yeah, that's another point where I'm gonna need to point towards the big ol' fantasy in the franchise title. Only 4 crystals existing, I can reconcile that a little easier. Perhaps at some point in the 1,000 years, all of the multiple shards of the Great Crystal somehow move their energy into just 4 of them. Maybe, since the Myrrh from the Myrrh trees had memories, not sure if I ever mentioned that, it included crystal memories. After all, the Great Crystal recorded every possible timeline. And so, after a very long time of moving Myrrh droplets from the Myrrh trees to other crystals, and then the tribes stopped relying on Myrrh trees, maybe it ended up where all of the crystal essence ended in 4 crystals. Does that make sense? No, not really. But fuck you, it's a fantasy game less than 500,000 people bought. As for the 4 crystals representing a tribe and creating them, yeah, I got nothing. If we're putting logic to it, then maybe it's a case where all 4 of the remaining crystals grew some attachment to the tribe they were closest to, and that's why the Ukes vanished with the crystal. I think that's as far as I'm willing to theorize on the interconnected lore to a sub-series that sometimes wants to connect and sometimes doesn't. How about we just chalk it all up to Chilinka Omniverse reset bullshit again? Also, while we're here, we finally have the answer to how the Ukes' appearance work, with a mid-Italian changing into a different suit of armor by exchanging their soul. Not much to say there, just cool. Finally answers a question from the original. After Lael talks around the Uke pocket dimension, he agrees to help a mid-Italian with bringing back the Ukes. But this is also the part of the game where all but one location opens up to us with a teleportation option, meaning it's time to finally talk about the real meat of Crystal Bears gameplay, the overworld missions and minigames. As I get into this, I want y'all to think about one thing. Crystal Bears is the first full 3D open world action game in the Final Fantasy series. That specific description doesn't fit any other Final Fantasy game by then. And I know that because I had to re-say it multiple times to not mean Dirge of Cerberus. Right around this point in history was when the tropes of 3D open world games had kinda set in. We already had Shenmue, GTA 3, Yakuza, etc. Final Fantasy 12 also offered a 3D open world, but it was still a turn-based RPG where you needed the bar to fill in order to take action. So Crystal Bears is, to my pretty informed knowledge at least, the first Final Fantasy game to take the route modern games like 7 Rebirth, 15, and 16 took. Now, why do I start by saying that, you may ask? Because quite frankly, the open world elements of Crystal Bears is really fucking bad. Recall back in all 3 of the dungeon crawlers. We had a stage-based system where you went to a town or dungeon from an overworld map. Once you finished at your current location, you went back to the map. You had a very good sense of direction at all times due to the simple nature. And they even went the extra mile in the first title to make sure every location truly made sense and affected what lay next to it. Not in Crystal Bears. Depending on how you want to count it, there's minimum 7, maximum a lot of areas to visit in Crystal Bears, and you'll have no clue how they connect on your first playthrough. Kawazu called the game's genre action attraction, and yeah, I'd say that's pretty accurate if we want to go through Six Flags without a fucking map, because hey, you don't have one. No mini-map at all for when you're inside of an area, and the closest you get to a world map is this screen. Do you want to take a guess how anything connects to anywhere? Because you'll probably get it wrong from this image. Desert suddenly turns into farmland after passing one town. Autumn trees change to extreme harsh snowy mountains where a church is situated. None of it flows into each other. It's disappointing given that all 3 dungeon crawlers had mini maps and even the mainline games had standardized them since 10. If we're gonna say narratively, pretty much the only logical placement is that the Selkie Guild and the beach next to them requires a train to reach. Since they're broken off from Lilties, it wouldn't make sense if you can walk there like you can to any other locations. Speaking of walking, traveling from area to area isn't just confusing, it's also time consuming. Lael doesn't walk too quickly. You can get a chocobo at specific points, but if you hop off of them, then to get a chocobo again, you have to walk all the way back or find another location. Sort of an issue when you can't use any bearer powers while on a chocobo. So let's say you want to travel by chocobo to this optional fight with skeletons. Well, now after you get off the chocobo to fight the enemies, you'll need to walk back on foot. A walk that happens to go through a chocobo raceway for an unrelated minigame. Something you should only traverse on chocobo. More than that, your best means of transit without a chocobo or transporter is by dodge rolling. And I don't think I've ever mentioned this. To dodge roll in Crystal Bears, you shake the Wii remote. While the most accurate hand motion to perform a dodge roll, at least on my old ass Wii remote, is the cow milking motion. Whenever I needed to traverse a large distance, I ended up sitting there and cleaning the pipe. Plus, with no map of any kind, that also means that if I went the wrong way, something I did often during my first run, it didn't matter if he felt spent, that monkey got spanked. Gaining teleportation does ease the issue very, very significantly, though it's not a perfect solution. Rather than opening the non-existent map, click on spot, fast travel, you need to find these interdimensional rifts that take you back to the alternate Uke dimension, where you can choose which of the other places to warp back to. This on its own isn't too bad, it's actually pretty handy since you can visually see every location, but after playing 16 and I'm about halfway through 7 Rebirth now, so my expectations are skewed to honestly an unfair position. Anyways, what you actually do in every location. I guess we can categorize what we do into 3 categories: combat, mini games that change gameplay mechanics, and mini missions that use Lael's base moveset. Let's start with the last one. As you walk around, you'll find a good chunk of civilians with problems. They don't always tell you their problem, but with context clues, you can try to figure them out. For example, sometimes you find farmers rolling down hills after they drop their produce, at which point you can use your powers to prevent them from a worse fall. You can also get an achievement by throwing Lilty guards into a trash chute where they walk out covered in goop, and there's a repeating challenge returning from the DS duo where you save cows from alien abduction. All of these quests are pretty harmless. I never frothed at the mouth looking to do them, but most of them either finish quickly or are right in your path of travel anyways, so they didn't waste my time. Anytime I reached a new location, I did glance around the room to see if I can figure out what one of those quests might be, though usually there's not many during the main campaign. I feel like for the most part, they're trying to add in the humor that Echoes of Time and the My Life duo had, but it does fall a little flat when these quests mostly lack any dialogue and the art style doesn't lend itself to humor as well as the old look. Still, they're cute enough. I think my favorite is the one where you find a kid that looks like King Charles.
What the hell is this?
It's a cute little Easter egg for Crystal Chronicles fans when there's not too many references to older titles. For the fights, I know I talked about these a lot earlier, but I do want to add a few thoughts that make more sense now. I mentioned before that specific areas on the map have possible fights, and that miasma rifts will unleash the monsters after a certain amount of time. Well, now I want to stress how poorly that's implemented. Some of the places these fights can occur have no indication they can happen at all. For example, the place you fight Blaze. It's a graveyard that, if you return to later, is filled with ghosts and mourners. As a boss fight already occurred here, you may assume that nothing else will happen. The only other real bosses are Bahamut and the final one, that both have their own special arenas you can't return to, so there's no reason to think a miasma portal can appear. When actually, one of the coolest fights in the game can. If you wait long enough, you get to battle against a special candlelit flan, some goblins, and 3 versions of Tonberry that I fucking loved. Like, these might be my new favorite non-standard Tonberry designs. The regular one hits hard like any other Tonberry we've seen before, with a skinnier look that makes them a little spookier in my opinion. But what makes them cooler is that when you pick them up, you have a chance to use a Tonberry knife that insta-kills almost everything. We also meet Tonberry Amok, a little voodoo boy who doesn't appear on your enemy radar because you can only find him if you pick up the homing needle he sends towards you, using it as a compass to track him down. Then we have the Tonberry Queen. She's great. It's a gothic Lolita Tonberry that wields a fucking chainsaw. It's so 2009 core. I love it. I really wish there was an indication about this fight. At best, maybe there's one in the built-in achievement list, which I never looked through because there's over 300 achievements and most hints are vague or need unlocking. I wasn't about to go through that. On top of this, the other best fights in the game are hidden as secondary fights, in areas where you already beat the enemy hordes. Again, nothing to indicate this. The only way to know is if you bothered reading all 322 achievement hints to maybe see that hint, or by beating a challenge and sitting there for a few minutes. Even longtime series staples are locked in these fights like Princess Flan, Jumbo Cactuar, and Malboro. They're all the best fights in the game. I have no issues with them, except for how there's no indication they exist. And if you fail or show up at the wrong time, you have to sit there doing nothing. I think that if you add up all of my time with Crystal Bears, I spent almost as much time waiting for a fight as I did fighting. That's not good. If you're gonna make adventure attraction, don't simulate waiting in line, especially when the combat itself still isn't perfect. Wonky camera, occasional motion issues, and a frame rate that kept a consistent 30 FPS during every part of the game, except the hardest encounters. Queen Tonberry's chainsaw cut that frame rate faster than it cut me. It's such a conflicting combat because of this. In a vacuum, it's a great, unique system that only the Wii could give. It uses the Wii's motion and pointer in an innovative way that, if it came out 2 years earlier when the Wii's novelty hadn't worn off, people would have praised it. But once you plug it into the horribly confusing open world, it becomes cumbersome. It really needed a battle select option in a menu somewhere, especially because of those 300 plus achievements, many are about performing creative maneuvers to finish a fight, such as growing a Jumbo Cactuar into a larger Jumbo Cactuar and throwing it at the enemies. So many creative choices, and I know they could have added that menu because one exists for the mini games, our final gameplay related subject. I keep using the word minigame to describe lots of Crystal Bear's design, which I think often applies well. The answer to most fights is to find a creative gimmick to solve it, such as throwing gunpowder into a Malboro's mouth, and these small missions involve other unique scenarios with Layle's moveset. One I found during New Game Plus involves shaking money bags off of monkeys. But then there's the other half of the game, actual minigames. Well, I found all of them somewhere between amusing and good. Overall, I think it harms the identity of Crystal Bears. Keep this in mind as I give my thoughts here. I love the side content of 7, 9, 13, and the 7 Remake series. I think that stuff is loads of fun, despite not adhering to the core gameplay of those titles. But it's also important to remember that the playtime of minigames never exceeds that of the core gameplay, and the lengthier ones, such as Chocobo Hot and Cold or Queen's Blood, were always optional. While with Crystal Bears, the main storyline, due in part to the optional nature of most fights, requires more minigames than core gameplay, making me wonder what's actually the core here? To answer that quickly, it's pointer-related telekinesis. The rail shooter, run from Lilty guards, chase towards the mid-Italian, fishing, and probably some others I'm forgetting, all primarily use the pointer. I enjoyed trying for a perfect score on these, except the rail shooter, which oddly enough wants you to suddenly change into a multiplayer mode to shoot down every monster. I don't think anywhere else in the game does that. Why is this here at the very beginning? Do they expect me to invite a friend over to start the journey and then after I finish the rail shooter I kick them out? Then we have the non-pointer minigames, which are often huge misses. I already mentioned steering the boat at the start, but there's a few, just two okay ones I guess. The train stealth section was neat. You only do it once, so I at least found it charming during my initial playthrough. Now then on my second run, I got caught and realized you can't lose, so I had Lael beat the shit out of everyone. Yeah, it doesn't matter how many times you get caught, what's a guard gonna do to Lael? As a rule of thumb, if there's no health bar on screen, you can't lose in Crystal Bears. There's also a very basic rhythm game where you shake the Wii remote or nunchuck when the notes pass by, so Lael can dance his way up to Princess Altea. It sort of reminds me of Theat Rhythm or the boss fights in Melody of Memory. Could this have inspired those? Probably not, though honestly the main reason I don't hate it is because there's a remix of a song from the first game. I pointed at the screen madly with a little giggle like a 12-year-old when I heard it, which I guess goes to show that for as much as I try to appreciate Crystal Bears for what it is, there's still some awkward parts that made me want a Crystal Chronicles closer to the dungeon crawlers. Those three games had no more than 2 mini-games each, at least ones that changed the core mechanics, so this drastic shift doesn't really sit right. I mean, it does put it a little closer to some of the mainline games I've mentioned, like 7, 9, and especially 7 Rebirth, but Crystal Chronicles? That's not really what it was about. After you join up with a mid-Italian, Lael's goals shift entirely. He doesn't actually care about the crystal principle since it goes against his independent nature, but he does care about Jagron killing people, especially because he plans to kill a lot of people. Lael jerks around to talk to the main characters, some requiring mini-games to reach, in hopes of figuring out a plan for stopping Jagron. This includes a visit to the princess through the dance minigame I mentioned, but since her father is gravely ill, her only way to stop Jagron is through the Lilty High Council, who she can't convince without proof of Jagron's misdeeds, allowing Jagron to deed missily. Jagron sends the Lilty army to detain every Selkie in the guild to place inside of a crystal-powered airship prison. In action, Lael can't just sit idly by for, so Mid-Italian uses their summoning powers to sneak him in. This airship is one of my favorite parts of Crystal Bears actually. I think mainly because it sticks to the core gameplay longer than anywhere else in the journey, and most of the cast actually gets a moment here. Of course, since this is a Selkie Lilty matter first and foremost, Belle and Kais join in on trying to save the guild members. Because while Lael plays the video game with neat platforming and a combat section, Belle learns of Jagron's plan. As it turns out, he plans to turn every Selkie to crystal so he can fuel the Alexis's engine. To Jagron, he sees Selkie as little more than pests, so using their lives to correct a blunder that's put his high status in jeopardy seems worth it to him. Not to Lael though, he sees it more worthwhile to make us play a god-awful Selkie rescue minigame. Throw debris at Jagron to distract him and eventually the Selkie might escape. Thankfully, you don't have to save everyone, but you'll probably feel like a grade A dickhead when it cuts to Jagron murdering Selkies as they scream for bloody murder. And now that I'm looking at it again, I don't know if a Selkie's turn to crystal counter in the top center was a very tasteful choice. Maybe they should have put a normal boss fight here instead. Once the Selkies escape Jagron's reach, everyone shows up to help. First, Kais walks in to show Jagron the scariest thing known to man: illegal court summons from Princess Altea and the Lilty High Council. As you can expect, a fight breaks out here, which looks cool as hell. Kinda wish you got to play it. We see Kais taking part in a full-on sword fight with Jagron right as a mid-Italian shows up and decides, fuck it, I'm gonna absorb the Ute crystals powering this ship too, whether it's timed well or not.
My thanks, Yuke.
Mommy, what the fuck? As the prison dwarfs the Alexis in size, Lael can't ease the fall as well as he could the other ship, nor can he make it easy for Kais and Belle to escape from such a shaky vehicle. Thankfully, Vigali shows up in the nick of time to save the Selkies, putting aside his differences with Kais to ensure his safety. Even if Selkies look out for themselves first, he cares about everyone else's survival. While everyone but Vigali made it out of the ship safely, they still don't have proof of Jagron's heinous actions. Or at least that's how it seemed. Turns out, Belle took a photo of Jagron using his bearer power at the very beginning on the Alexis. She just never shared the photos because she wanted to gain money from it and not end the game in 20 minutes. With her proof, she and Kais head towards Alphateria to prove to the Council of Jagron's actions, while Lael joins the Mid-Italian in putting the crystals from the prison back in their rightful place. Where Mid-Italian, a little forgetful goof, lets him know that in the instance where the Yuke crystal is revived, it may, but maybe not, reactivate a silly, really not that important spell the Yukes attempted to cast on the Lilty crystal, which would destroy it. Information that Jagron just happens to hear because he hit himself off camera.
Just in time.
With the Mid-Italian sacrificing themselves to save Lael, he yet again owes them one, meaning even if there is that totally unlikely scenario where the spell destroys the Lilties, he feels responsible for reviving the Yukes and stopping Jagron. Immediately upon stepping out, Jagron readies a whole firing squad to kill Lael, dozens of guards ready to shoot him down. Realistically, he could probably stop any bullets coming at him, but crystal bears can only fit in a certain number of cool things. To stop something that cool, Belle, Princess Altea, and Kais, now dressed as a Selkie again to represent his distrust of Jagron's army, appear to arrest Jagron. No big boss fight or anything. Lael stops him in the cutscene with his powers, but no fight here. Next shot, everyone's back at Sid's workshop reading the paper about Jagron's arrest. Obviously, that's not where the story ends. It's just a very awkward stop because immediately afterwards you head back to Alphateria to get Altea's crystal idol. Yeah, I don't know. I feel like they could have walked downtown for this scene and then cut to the next scene instead of making the player jerk it to the final boss. I guess it has something similar with Final Fantasy VIII. Saying that, I guess I've given away what's up next. Down where the army has kept the Alexis 1, different from the Alexis 2, Altea takes Jagron to visit her ailing father, who isn't actually sick from a normal illness as most of the kingdom believes. Jagron turned the king into a crystal. So Altea brings Jagron here in this dark, hidden, very safe room with only her and him present in hopes that he can reverse the crystal effect to save her father. He doesn't do that. Jagron resents the king for his cowardice, as despite his willingness to use crystal engines initially, he backed out at the last moment. Jagron's even more upset because it was an experiment he ordered that caused his crystal mutation. So he kinda has a reason to hate the king, though maybe not enough to do this. Jagron uses the situation that Altea set up so easily for him to remove all the crystal energy from Altea's crystal idol so he can fly the Alexis once more, and crash land the floating bus Lael and Kais were riding. Yeah, I know, bad timing. I fucking hated this QTE. It wants you to furiously jerk the Wii Remote off, but if you set the sensitivity too low in the options, you have no chance of winning. I went through about 7 wrist-murdering tries before I thought about changing my settings. I experienced the most brutal pain in my wrist attempting this, and that's after the rest of the game of waggling. Once you get past that, Crystal Bear switches to possibly the wildest, most bombastic ending of any Final Fantasy game to that point. First off, Jagron rips off Altea's clothes.
Rated T for teen.
To find out that the Lilty princess herself is also a crystal bearer, possessing the ability to not turn into crystal. Okay, she got the short stick. To save Altea, Sid calls upon Kais and Lael to show a fixed-up, steam-powered Alexis 2 that can fly towards Jagron so long as Lael's willing to give it an extra bearer-powered boost, leading to a full-on airship battle between the Alexis and Alexis 2. Not when you play because it's crystal bears, though they threw in one QTE where you veer to the side. Upon reaching Jagron, he throws Altea off the Alexis to scare Lael. Lael jumps down to save her, releases the crystal energy within her crystal idol to revive the Yukes, thus reenacting the Yuke spell to destroy the Lilty crystal. A huge problem that, we really didn't think would happen if it weren't for the sudden ass pull that Altea's bearer powers lets her protect the Lilty crystal. So at least Square Enix gave a woman powers at the last minute and let her do something with it. Thanks to Altea taking care of the crystal, Lael can use his time to deal with Jagron, who uses his abilities to fuse with the boat into a a final boss. While a scary situation to most people, it's not an issue for us because Lil can fly and go Super Saiyan now. Yet not even a transformation sequence for him. They cut away for Jagron's transformation, then the next shot with Lael, he's transformed. Meaning, as you may expect, the final boss does not use the standard gameplay. It's another rail shooter. I mean, a little more unique than just a rail shooter. You rip off parts of the Alexis to use as guns or throw back at Jagron. It's a neat concept. I'm just extremely taken aback by a Final Fantasy game that ends with a Super Saiyan boss fight. It gave me extreme Sonic vibes to the point where I think they should have gone the full 9 yards and added a vocal track. Like, with all the ridiculous shit Crystal Bears has thrown at us so far, I'm also kinda glad they ended like this. I think it drives in just how different they wanted to make this game, even if it doesn't land every time. With the Alexis's destruction, Yuke tribes return, and rescue of the Lilti crystal, the day is saved. Altea becomes the queen of the Lilti with plans to bring peace between tribes, and Kais plans to become the new leader of the Selkie Guild to honor Vigali. Only one issue remains: no one knows what happened to Lael. It seems he sacrificed himself to stop Jagron, and likely doesn't have bearer powers anymore since Altea lost hers. None of the cast knows if Lael survived, but they do have a bit of hope. As do we, because after a long aerial shot through everywhere we went, the camera moves to Lael on a cruise ship, still with his bearer powers, potentially the only bearer still around, off to his next adventure. For as conflicted as I am about most of Crystal Bears, I love the ending. All the tribes have returned, and the side casts have proper resolutions, and the sweep through our locations lets us reflect on the journey we experienced. Not only that, Lael's position on a boat gives us the sense that he's going out on a new adventure. He, a man who's part crystal, doesn't end his chronicle here like how the past 3 journeys ended. Lael doesn't know what's next. Adventure awaits him with maybe a whole new set of characters and locations. Though nearly 15 years after this scene, we know that's not the case. So what exactly do we get out of Crystal Bears? Is it the true continuation of the GameCube Crystal Chronicles? Not exactly. It shares a world, but almost nothing else. Yeah, it's the next physical console game in the series, but I don't think I can ever make an argument that if you enjoyed the dungeon crawlers, you're surefire to like Crystal Bears. It's a fully linear, cinematic, attraction action game. If I put one of the fight scenes from Crystal Bears next to one of the slow intros to a dungeon in the original game next to each other, you'd think these are different franchises. Even by gameplay alone, straying this far from the prior installments, as well as the other Final Fantasy entries as a whole, probably wasn't a good idea. It's a huge shift, one that I think we can only properly discuss if we take the context of Crystal Bears' release year in mind. 1 year earlier, Dissidia and Crisis Core released on PSP, and we had the promise of Versus 13 on PS3. The idea of real-time, fast-action Final Fantasy became hot, mainly thanks to the popularity of Kingdom Hearts and especially Advent Children. In fact, pretty much every Final Fantasy game on console after Advent Children, besides 12, which was almost done at the time, strived for an Advent Children look, which in a certain way makes it even more baffling that Crystal Chronicles, the action FF series at the time, drove in a completely different direction. If the Nintendo Wii is locked to only having Crystal Chronicles games, there's a good chance some of the install base wanted a Final Fantasy closer in line with what the other systems received. Whether that means a real turn-based game besides ports, or an action game with combat adhering closer to what you'd expect of a Final Fantasy protagonist. Like, if I ask 30 people of various ages what they think of when I ask them about Final Fantasy battle systems, I doubt I'd receive a single response saying puzzle action combat. Even looking forward, none of the current era of action-focused Final Fantasy, meaning 16, 7 remakes, and Strangers, have these no weapons, puzzly minigame-esque elements. It's just not fans nor the general audience's first thought with Final Fantasy. I know, Final Fantasy changes often, but at the very least, back then, everything stuck somewhat close to the idea of menu combat. In fact, to my knowledge, this is only the 3rd console Final Fantasy game not to have some form of menu combat. Well, the first 2 were Chocobo Racing and Dirge of Cerberus, so I don't even know if I want to count those. Even if we do, those released on PS1 and PS2, systems with tons of options for Final Fantasy, while the Wii, outside of Crystal Chronicles, only had Chocobo Dungeon 3 made directly for the system. Crystal Bears just strayed too far far in a different direction from FF fare. Not to mention the usual Crystal Chronicles fare. We only have one tiny lick of multiplayer with the rail shooting minigame, and a small amount of customization with equipment I never even felt important to mention. Two aspects that the prior 3 physical games had in spades. I get the feeling that this is also part of the reason Echoes of Time received that Wii port, so Wii users could have a Crystal Chronicles dungeon crawler to make up for Crystal Bear's differing direction. It also feels like Itahana, Akatoshi, and the rest of the team wanted Crystal Bears to lead into a new era for Crystal Chronicles in the new era they set up. I already talked about implications for prequels with Blaze and Kais, but they're set up for sequels as well. Belle implied she wants to search for Lael. Lael still has his crystal powers, implying a disturbance in the crystal principle, and the final screen we see says, "Until we meet again," with Kawazu's signature. I don't think they wanted it to end here. However, this is when Final Fantasy went through some rough times. Not long after Crystal Bears, we received the long-awaited Final Fantasy 13. It sold really well, received great reviews from critics, and then casual folks played it. Final Fantasy 13 suffered the most critically scathing reviews from Final Fantasy fans of the time, and for some good reasons. I'm 13's biggest defender until you compare it to any Final Fantasy besides 2 and 3. People acted like it was Final Fantasy's own Sonic 06 or 3D World Runner 2, a fate I don't think it deserves, partially because Final Fantasy 14 1.0 released less than a year later. Everyone agrees 14 sucked at launch, so much that even the CEO of Square Enix as a whole had to apologize. And I feel like that negative opinion of Final Fantasy bled onto Crystal Bears. If you look at reviews that came out upon release, some of them had nuance. No one called it perfect, because it's not, but only a few people wrote it off as waggle moat garbage. It's only after 13's and 14's reception that it seems people started lumping Crystal Bears in there if they knew Crystal Bears existed at all. I've seen a few people lately looking at Bears with a more open mind today, and I kinda hope more players can do that. Because if you can forget that this is Final Fantasy, and especially forget that this is Crystal Chronicles, you'll find a Wii game you can't find anywhere. It might even be easier to play today because some of the aspects I'm lampooning Crystal Bears on for straying from Final Fantasy norms became more standard going forward. This is the first console open world 3D action game in the Final Fantasy series. If we think of the recent games including 15, 16, both of the 7 remakes so far, and to a lesser extent Lightning Returns, that's kind of the standard of Final Fantasy. Am I saying that those teams looked toward Crystal Bears for inspiration? Absolutely fucking not. At best, one person on the Final Fantasy 16 team might have brought up how naming the crystal-infused outcast Bearers was similar to our silly Wii subject. And if that did happen, I get the feeling it was some random 3D modeler talking to another 3D modeler during their coffee break, rather than a leading figure like a script writer or project manager. Titles after Crystal Bears also tended to get more over the top with their cutscenes. Take a look at Strangers of Paradise or the 13 trilogy. They're filled with bombastic cutscenes that entries pre-Crystal Bears never pulled off. Final Fantasy 16 takes it even further with the plot of Crystal Bears hated by society, lack of any menu combat, and skip to this point to avoid slight spoilers for 16. Okay, that's enough time. Super Saiyan boss fights. I played 16 right after Crystal Bears, so it blew my fucking mind that it had boss fights where the hero transformed. I texted 2 specific friends when I reached that point in Crystal Bears, and they were snickering behind my back since they had both made it far into 16. I was ready to call Lael's transformation the most un-Final Fantasy thing in the series, yet the mainline games did it just a few months before I played Crystal Bears. So back to the question from earlier, is Crystal Bears Final Fantasy? I mean, yeah, again, it has Final Fantasy in the title. That means it is. Square Enix said so. But also, yeah, I guess. It's still definitely one of the weirder, more out there, but it's no Dirge of Cerberus. Recently, I watched a friend play through that one because I couldn't emulate it. And yeah, it turns out that has pretty much all of the oddities I pointed out in Crystal Bears, except it's attached to a significantly worse story. If there's one game that I can say feels the least like Final Fantasy, it's Dirge. Don't expect a Dirge video anytime soon. Maybe if I get a better computer to play it. Crystal Bears was legitimately ahead of the game compared to the rest of the series. It just had a really, really bad timing. Not only because of the poorly reviewed games after release, but what came before release. I think when we look at Crystal Chronicles today, a lot of people want to point at Crystal Bear's weirdness or even Nintendo's strange place in the console market in the early 2010s for the series' fall. Crystal Bears sold badly, it was too different from the prior 5 games, 13 and 14 stained the FF reputation, Nintendo made underperforming systems and then underselling systems with the Wii U. Those factors all likely contributed to Square ceasing to make Crystal Chronicles games. Though more importantly, I think it comes down to post-merger Square's insistence at the time of producing polymorphic content. Products, be that novels, films, games, or TV shows, stemming from a singular idea. In the mid to late 2000s, Square Enix went hard on this idea with Final Fantasy. We had Final Fantasy XI and its ongoing expansions. They used the idea set by Final Fantasy Tactics and Vagrant Story to continue the Ivalice series consisting of Final Fantasy Tactics Advance 1 and 2, Final Fantasy 12, 12 Revenant Wings, and too many browser and mobile games for me to count. The compilation of Final Fantasy VII with Before Crisis, Crisis Core, Advent Children, Dirge of Cerberus, Last Order, and multiple novels, all 6 Crystal Chronicles games, plus a few untranslated manga and novels I never got to talk about in this retrospective. And finally, the promise of Fabula Nova Crystallis, which would have consisted of 3 games bearing the 13 title. Besides the FNC games and 11's initial release, everything I mentioned came out between 2003 and 2009. That's 13 games in 7 years, 14 if we throw in Dissidia, more than I care to count once we factor in ports and remakes. Square absolutely released too many Final Fantasy games to expect all of them to perform well. It's no shock that the one prioritizing Nintendo's home consoles got the biggest axe. Every hardcore Final Fantasy fan I've met buys the Sony system if they want to play Final Fantasy on console. Just the promise of 13 had people buying PS3s, and if they wanted to play Final Fantasy on handheld, the PSP and DS did not lack in that regard either. Eventually, Square's insistence on polymorphic content blew up in their face. Ivalice had a soft stop after Tactics A2, with only a few nods and high-quality remasters. Compilation of FF7 has never been fully accessible in English. 13's mixed reception caused FNC to change course completely, and Versus 13 turned into the 15 series, which was potentially the biggest mess of them all. They laid out too long of a plan for 15, resulting in the final DLC never releasing. Though I think that's what was needed. Square Enix seems to have mostly learned from their method and settled on a new model of one very finished game and a big DLC pack 1 year later. Kingdom Hearts 3, Final Fantasy 16, Strangers of Paradise, and sort of 7 Remake all did that. And while it may have ended poorly, I think we do have one good thing to come out of the polymorphic era. There's lots of games to play from this time. I assume many of you, have not played every game in this 7-year span. Many of these are growing increasingly easy to play so long as you're open to less than legal methods and maybe some long setup time for Crystal Chronicles. Because sadly, this sub-series itself is still a mess to play as intended. Even if you use pirating methods, you need multiple people for 3 of them, original hardware to play multiplayer on 2 of them at the moment, a good method for touch controls on Ring of Fates if you don't use original hardware, acceptance of a strange screen setup for the GameCube game, and a Wii Remote with a sensor bar for Crystal Bears. I know, God do I fucking know, I'm not making it sound easy, but I truly recommend some of you try out this sub-series. Not a single Final Fantasy game has ever gotten co-op quite as good as the dungeon crawlers. The mayhem, the trust, the insertion of ourselves into a world with loads of lore. Crystal Chronicles does that so well. I really hope that someday Square can write in that chronicle again. Crystal Chronicles has received some representation lately with World of FF, Opera Omnia, and Theatrhythm, but nothing truly Crystal Chronicles focused besides the lackluster remake. Recalling, replaying, and first playing on some of the titles in this series has been a blast for me. Even if I'm the only one willing to chronicle these journeys, I'm glad I did. I hope all of you enjoyed hearing about it.